I'm Chance Dorland, and in San Antonio, military means local. This is Military City, a new podcast from ExpressNews.com, where I'm joined each episode by San Antonio Express News senior reporter Sig Christensen, who was embedded with the 3rd Infantry Division during the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, and has reported on military-related topics for decades. On this program, we discuss the military stories important to San Antonio and the U.S., both from today and the past. And Sig, we kind of cover both of those areas because on our current episode, we're talking about someone who recently marked her 100th birthday last weekend. But the reason we're discussing her and her amazing story, and I'll just quickly add some amazing audio that you've recorded, we'll hear several clips of that, is because this woman is a World War II nurse who saw quite a lot of things and experienced a lot of things from the past. So we kind of have both of those keywords in today's podcast. So great to have you back here on the program, Sig. Tell me about this amazing World War II nurse that you spoke with.
Well, Chance, Arlene Reedland Sheets is one of the last of the Mohicans, so to speak. She was at one time one of 74,000 women who served in the Army and Navy Nurse Corps in World War II. And there is actually a long tradition of women serving as nurses and supporting the troops. It goes all the way back to the Civil War. But she had a front row seat to one of the biggest stories of the entire war, D-Day. She was based at a hospital near Swindon, England, and this hospital, the 130th hospital, this facility, it's called the 130th Station Hospital to be precise, and this hospital treated thousands of Normandy casualties from D-Day through probably some of the big battles of the European conflict going through the end of 1944. In all, there were 13,000 wounded who came to that hospital, and they only lost 12 of them. So this was a pretty good place. If you got there, you were almost certain to survive. And she lived it. She's a veteran. And like every veteran that you ever meet, she has these memories that just won't go away. And, you know, it's kind of sad because she cries a lot. She chokes up. She thinks about the people that she served with. They're all alive in her head. They're all alive in her mind. She visualizes them. She can hear them talking. But, of course, she's the last of them.
And Sig, before we start getting into some of these amazing audio clips, and I really do want to stress, this is probably, I can't imagine doing a more special episode with you than, you know, what we're going to hear in a moment. A World War II nurse from the San Antonio and Houston area. So once again, local, you know, national, international stories from both today and the past. Let's talk about her wedding night. She actually got married right before D-Day, correct?
She got married hours before D-Day. They married at a church, and this church wasn't very far from the 130th Station Hospital. Wasn't very far from his barracks either. George Sheets was a lieutenant and was apparently a very bright guy, and he would have a outstanding career in the Army. Before long, he would have a Silver Star. That's the 3rd highest award for gallantry that a soldier can receive. He and Arlene married at 2:00 in a church in England. They then had no place to go for a honeymoon, so Lieutenant Sheets's boss, Rudy Quillian, a lieutenant colonel, loaned them his barracks, and there was nobody in there. And they went in, they set up a cake in the kitchen. They had their honeymoon, and before midnight, George Sheets and Rudy Quillian were on their way to muster for D-Day, and they would land at Utah Beach a couple of days later. And she was back at the hospital. And a few hours later, the first casualties started coming in. But you say you and 2 nurses. What were you doing?
Well, they were in my wedding party, so we went to Tidworth Barracks where 2nd Armored Division was, and I was to see George. I saw him about every weekend. England was on restriction or off restriction, on restriction, off restriction, to fool the Germans. That was what General Eisenhower was doing. Well, that weekend just happened to be the one that was the real McCoy, and the next day was going to be the invasion. And they told me, y'all can get married, but you cannot go away as you planned on your honeymoon. And we decided to get married anyway. And we got married the 5th of June at 2 o'clock at St. Mary's Church of England. And Reverend Thompson was the Reverend. But afterwards, we had no place to go. So Colonel Quillian, his battalion commander, George had 4 roommates. He didn't have any roommates. So he loaned us his quarters. That was our honeymoon. And after the wedding, we went to his quarters. In the kitchen, sent up a chocolate cake for our wedding cake. And we enjoyed it in spite of not getting to go away. And about midnight, the English taxi picked me and my 2 nurse friends, Josephine Martinez and Pat Crocker, I remember now. And we are on our way back to Mount Hospital, which is about 20 miles away. And the big planes were going overhead. We knew it was the paratroopers because we hear them all the time. And we held each other's hands, but we just didn't say a word. We knew the invasion was on. I remember it all. And when we went to my hospital, and we sleep a little while and get up and get dressed, and the patients were already coming in. We had a big tent with a walking wounded, and I was receiving the ones in the knees and heart, the more seriously wounded. And someone from the walking wounded called out and said, "Hey, Lieutenant Reedland." And it was one of my patients from Brooke Army, that I knew before I went overseas. Wasn't that a coincidence? Wow. I waved at him, I recognized him.
And so, as I mentioned, Sig, this audio is just fantastic. I'm really just delighted to be able to hear these stories, and it's so great that you were able to speak to Arlene. We have 4 more clips coming up. This next one, Arlene, just tell me briefly, she talks about the first patients that started coming in very quickly.
They did. There were a lot of walking wounded, and interestingly, there was at least one of them who remembered her from his time at Brooke Army Hospital in San Antonio. That was where Arlene began as her career as an Army nurse. She had just come out of nursing school, and the Red Cross signed her up as a nurse almost immediately. The Army was pretty flat-footed before the war, and I think they had maybe 1,000 nurses, and obviously they needed a lot more. And so as soon as these people came out of nursing school, they were scooped up, and so she runs into one of those people. She has already gotten a taste of what's going on D-Day, because as they're walking back to that hospital only a few hours before, she's hearing the sounds of the C-47s as they fly overhead, and they're flying toward Normandy, where the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions parachute into the war. Certainly one of the most storied events of any conflict in human history, this parachute jump that was done by 2 divisions. And she's in the middle of it. These guys are coming back, they're wounded, their uniforms start to pile up outside, and you'll soon get an understanding of the idea that she comes up with next as she takes a look at those uniforms. She gets an idea, and it's a really good one.
And we got patients in their combat clothes with parts of him torn away to repair an arm or leg or whatever. So we quickly took their combat clothes off, put them in little pajamas. We had army pajamas, clean white sheets, and we had hot food for them and penicillin, and we dressed their wounds when necessary. And that was our routine every 24 or 48 hours for the rest of our tour there. We would act like a transit hospital, and then if they were well enough, we sent them to a general hospital. And when I got off that evening, there was a big pile of the combat uniforms in the front yard of my Neeson hut. And I asked, what are they going to do with them? They said, we will destroy them. They're old. So I took my bandage scissors. They said I could cut off the patches. And I cut off the patches of all that I could, because I knew they all were wounded and they gave their blood for their country, and I wanted to save the patches. That would have been, I knew my mother could make a nice quilt from them, and I took them home, and when I got home, she blocked off 20 blocks and made a beautiful quilt out of the patches of my first war-wounded patients.
That is so powerful, Sig, that, she saved parts of those uniforms, brought them back, and then, someone from her family was able to make something out of it. That's just mind-blowing. That is a very, very positive story from something that obviously was a very negative event. Everyone dying, no one enjoys fighting in war, but I think a lot of people would say that often it's justified, and World War II in American history is often looked at in that way. You mentioned Brooke Army Hospital before. That is our next clip, and unfortunately there were quite a few horrors that she experienced connected to Brooke Army Hospital.
When she returns from Europe, the Army puts her back at Brooke Army Hospital. And a little note about what is now called BAMC, Brooke Army Medical Center. This hospital is built in the early 1930s, and it becomes one of the Army's most important hospitals over the next several wars. So World War II, Korea, and troops from Vietnam come back there to recover from their wounds. And it's part of what makes San Antonio Military City, USA. So many soldiers and Marines and airmen, people who ended up coming back from the war in Vietnam, they would end up stopping in San Antonio. And the ones at BAMC, more than a few of them stayed. They liked San Antonio. This was a city that actually embraced the troops at a time where most troops were just ignored at best. It was not a popular war, Vietnam. And the one place that seemed to welcome troops of all stripes was San Antonio. And so you see a core reason why the city is Military City, USA. And so Earlene is coming back, and BAMC is getting its first real road test. Built in the 30s, it's now a big center of surgery and recovery for these troops. And more than a few of them have come from the Pacific, and some have come from the prison camps in the Philippines. Some survived the Death March, the Bataan Death March. But one thing you'll know if you read anything, about the Bataan Death March and the Japanese prison camps is that the people who survived them often didn't survive long after the war. Many of them died within 5 years. And more than a few of them suffered horrific injuries. And she talked about that in this clip. There were a lot of patients from the war at Fort Sam, too, weren't there?
Yes. And later on, I took care of some that had real bad feet and dehydrated. I think they were in the Bataan Death March. I'm not sure now, but I thought that at the time. And they all dehydrated, and and we brought them back to health. But some of their feet, the doctors could just turn the foot, the little toe or big toe would fall off. Was that trench foot? It seemed like. I don't know. But that was from Asia.
Their toes would just fall off.
Yeah, and they were black, rotten. So when the doctor could, they would send them to surgery. They cut off their feet or the toes and then help them to walk again. But we got in, at that time on my ward, we were getting in people from Asia, I guess, or the Philippines, or where it was, where they were fighting, and they had captured American soldiers, the Japanese had, and then they were let go. That was later, much later.
So you saw that. Was that the worst you saw? Those prisoners coming back from Asia? Was that the worst?
I guess because they were so badly treated and they were dehydrated, and a lot of them couldn't walk because they'd lose their toes, and some of them lost their whole foot. But they were on marches, I guess. I don't know why they were so mistreated, but they were.
How did that make you feel?
You don't forget it. You feel bad for your countrymen, young men.
That was really hard clip to hear, Sig. I'm not even quite sure what to say about that. So I guess let's move on. There's still more audio to hear, and not as if this last story that we just heard wasn't powerful, but this next clip is just so powerful, and it's so sad. But I think it's a great representation, as she notes, of what was happening while she was serving. Tell me just very briefly about this couple that was separated that she's going to talk about.
Well, Arlene was really good at striking up friendships, and she became close to a nurse while she was in Chesilton, England, at the 130th Station Hospital. And this nurse got involved with an enlisted man. And in those days, those relationships were allowed. So the nurse was an officer, and she was separated and sent to one theater, and he was sent to the other. If I remember right, he was sent to the Pacific Theater, and they were due to meet in California. Well, the meeting never happened. And the story of how that happened and why is really sad, but it's a genuine, true war story. And there must have been thousands and thousands of them just like it in various places. This is her story.
One of the girls that was in my unit, before we went overseas, the government sent him to Asia and her to Europe because they married. And at that time, they were letting enlisted men marry the officers. She's just a second lieutenant, but she married a sergeant. And he went to Asia. She came in my unit. And she wrote me she was going to California to meet him after the war, or it was nearer after the war, I'm sure that. But she got there and waited all night, and she went aboard the next day, and they told her that he had died during the night. And she just took his body back home. She didn't see him anymore alive. I don't know, you saw a lot of sad things like that. I hate to be emotional, and I don't ever think about it now, but I'm usually not emotional, but I'm thinking about it now.
And then finally, Sig, there's just so much audio of your conversation with Arlene, but this last clip that we're going to hear, really perfect, really perfect way to end this podcast. Tell me about the special question that you asked Arlene that I'm sure she's probably thought about time and time again and will until, the day she leaves this earth.
Arlene has memories locked in her head that she doesn't talk about. And she has a lot of memories, as you can tell from these clips, that she does talk about, and she becomes very emotional over. Just like any veteran of any war, male or female, she carries them with her. And I think at the end of this process, you have to decide, and I don't know how it happens, but I think at the end of the process of having been there and lived it, you end up asking yourself what it meant and was it worth it? And would you do it again? And Arlene has an answer for that. If you were to send her back tomorrow, if she was 20 years old again, or 21, Arlene would tell you exactly what she'd do. And she wouldn't just do it once, she would do it 100 times. That's how much this experience meant to her and how worthy it was, how important her job was. And when you ask her if she made a difference, if she helped, she'll tell you that, yeah, she really did. She really did make a difference in the war effort. And for the many men that I hear about who are wounded and lonely, some of them who are dying, the simple comfort of a nurse sitting next to them holding their hand when there was no medicine for them, not even pain medicine, just doing something as simple as holding her hand, that ends up becoming the most important medicine that you can give. And so when you ask her, was this worth it? She has an answer. You do this again. You really are glad that you went off and did this.
Oh, my goodness, yes. It's the best thing I ever did in my life, and I know it. And it made me feel that I could do something for my country, and I was happy about it. All the nurses were. We worked hard.
And Sig, we're just now finishing up. That was our last clip of Arlene Riedlin Sheets, a World War II nurse from the San Antonio and Houston area who this past weekend marked her 100th birthday. I hope many more are in store for her. What a show, Sig. That's all I can say to end out here.
I don't know what you can say about those folks. They gave everything they had, and because they did, and because they were so committed to the cause, we, in the end, triumphed. And we triumphed over evil and brutality. We laid the groundwork for what people will I think, centuries from now call a period of relative peace and tranquility. This has been a remarkable era since World War II. The prosperity has been unprecedented. There wasn't America before the war. It was largely rural, and it was often poor. After World War II, the United States became highly urbanized and astonishingly wealthy. These people made it happen. And their commitment, and hers, when you hear it in her voice, it sure makes you want to be like them. It makes you want to do the same thing, because that time of their lives gave meaning to them, meaning that they probably never felt anywhere else quite the same way. But we owe a lot to those folks, and I'm glad that she is still here to talk about it, because this tape in particular, this podcast, if people listen to it 5 years from now, 10 years from now, they'll be right there with her long after she's gone. And they'll have an understanding of what it must have been like to have been a nurse at an Army hospital on D-Day.
San Antonio Express News senior reporter Sig Christensen. As always, Sig, thank you, but especially for today's episode, it has been a pleasure. Thank you for everything that you do, man. This is, like I said, this podcast is obviously special for so many reasons, but this episode particularly, a very special one. So thank you, Sig. I'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Chance.